We're talking about poster design today, and poster design is um, a far-reaching topic, and there is lots and lots of stuff that in between the things that we are going to be talking about. But we're going to try to connect the turn of the 19th to the 20th century in Europe to the 1960s in San Francisco. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So we're going to be putting those two things together. So um, let's go. And first off, I've got kind of a psychedelic uh, shout out to Ward, who we lost over the weekend. If you hadn't heard, Ward died on Saturday, and we're all just heartbroken here. Um, so this is for you, buddy. And uh, so here we're starting with this image of two poster exhibitions. One is in Germany around uh, circa 1900, and one is probably the Museum of Modern Art in New York when they had some sort of poster show. It could have been MoMA in San Francisco. I probably just found this image online, but you can see that they are featuring the psychedelic poster. It's part of their permanent collections of both MoMAs and is considered a serious art form, even though it had its beginnings in lowbrow art. And we're going to try and give a little history of both of these time periods. So just to put things in context, um, this is Jules Chéret, and he was considered the father of the Parisian poster. And he did both of these are for no, the one on the left is for the Folies Bergère, and next we're going to show you Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, who took over. He was actually hired by the man who was running the Moulin Rouge to update Chéret's look. Chéret did about a dozen posters, 13 posters for the Moulin Rouge, and the proprietor was getting a little tired of it, so they hired Lautrec, and the poster on the left is his first poster for the Moulin Rouge, and caused a sensation. There were some modern things happening here that were influenced by Japanese graphic design. The silhouettes in the background, the flattening of certain things, some simplification, and it made Lautrec a poster design star right from the beginning, like overnight, because of this poster on the left. Down in the lower right is the logo for the printing press that did most of the San Francisco psychedelic posters, and was named after Lautrec. It was called T. Lautrec Lithography. And David Singer, who will be closing the show with today, designed that logo. And those of you who are Friends of Calligraphy members, hopefully will remember the story we did on David just 2 issues ago. Actually, it was, yeah, 2 issues ago. And also at the time, of course, was Art Nouveau. And the epitome of Art Nouveau poster design, of course, was Alphonse Mucha. He was a Czech artist, but he came to fame by doing these posters in Paris. So the Art Nouveau poster, and the interesting thing about these guys, this is before radio, this is before television. So there weren't the kind of well-known artists that were being broadcast. So print media was gigantic. Print media was everything. So the people who designed, some of these people who designed these posters were international stars. And Mucha was maybe the biggest of all of them. He had a following in the United States. He did work in the United States and came to the United States a little bit. And as well as moving around and did so many things. If you ever get to Prague, there's a wonderful little museum devoted to his work there, as well as his gigantic stained glass windows in the cathedral up on the hill in Prague. So Prague is a Mucha town if you get there. And here are 3 more Parisian posters. from that time period, 1890s, whenever this might have been, turn of the century. And the important thing to see here is that there was elaborate decoration and somewhat realistic shading. Uh, and so, it was a flowery time. There was lots and lots of detail. So what came next, the simplification that came next was a revolution, a big revolution. Here's a couple of German examples of poster design from that same time. And of course, they're using more black letter style lettering, but the same thing, lots and lots of detail and flowery contents. So this revolution of simplicity that happened, it happened all of a sudden, and it began with these two Englishmen, James Pride and William Nicholson, and they were known as the Beggarstaffs, and they were brothers-in-law. I think it was Nicholson that married Pride's sister, and they only operated together for 5 years, from 1894 to 1899, I'm sorry. And what's interesting is that they just eschewed all of that detail, all of that floweriness that was happening. This poster on the left was their first together, and they lived in one of them at least lived above a pub that was frequented by actors. And so this the star of this version of Hamlet they're advertising here knew them from the pub. They were drinking pals, and asked them to design this poster. And this poster was originally done with cut paper. The black is cut paper, and the beige and skin color were done with stencils on butcher paper. And it's theorized, since none of these survived, it's theorized that they actually printed all of them themselves using stencils, the black included, that they cut out stencils and hand, force the color through these stencils for the handful of posters that were made. But the simplicity was what was gigantic. And so they were famous for flattening out colors, having the background color invade the main image, like the beefeater on the right. And the interesting, they only lasted 5 years because they were not commercially successful. So it was, the public didn't go for what they were doing. Here's a little bit more. The two on the left are Beggarstaffs. The Don Quixote was another poster for a play that didn't even get printed because the producer of the play didn't think that the likeness of the actor who was playing Don Quixote, that it looked good enough or flattering enough to get people to come to the play. So that didn't even get produced. So they didn't get many commissions, and they split up and went their separate ways in 1899, and both had successful careers otherwise, but they were so influential to subsequent poster artists that this is why they're so important in history, even though they weren't a success at the time. It's kind of like, you ever hear that about the Velvet Underground? Those first couple of albums were big flops, but everybody who did hear them started a band. So the Beggarstaffs were like that, in that they influenced all the poster artists that came after them. One of them is Ludwig Holbein on the right. And you can see, especially in the coat, how they, rather than making the pattern of the coat realistic, they just flatten it out. And it's also, or Ludwig flattened it out, and it's letting in the background into this, the stripes between the checkerboard on the coat. So that comes directly from the Beggarstaffs. So we might as well talk about Holbein while we're here. This is a couple of my favorites. The one on the left I loved for a long, long time, and then found another book that had the copy of the poster on the right, and noticed that this is in English. So this was for an American client that Holbein worked for. So he was also internationally known, and noticed the flat colors, the background coming into the shadows on the figure on the on both sides, actually. And but what I loved about it as he went along is that he started to put this detail, this textural detail, in all of these backgrounds. On the one on the right, it's just gorgeous stuff. while he's still maintaining the simplicity and the flatness of the background and the colors. Um, these were done on stone, with stone lithography. And the way they worked in those days was that the artist would have done a maquette, a painting, a small painting, to show the printing technicians what they wanted it to look like. So probably everything that we're seeing was created by the people who were making the prints, and not Holbein himself. And this goes on through history. Type designers, and we'll see it again with a beautiful lettering artist from the 20s, whose all his work were woodcuts. So it was his woodcuts. And of course, Hermann Zapf and August Rosenberg. Rosenberg was cutting the punches for Koch's types, etc. So the same thing was happening here. And these, I noticed that Steve Hosmer came in the crowd, and Steve and I share a deep love for this. Steve's got an amazing collection of books about posters from this time period. And he read someplace that this texture that's happening in all of these colored backgrounds was created by using mineral water and mineral oil and water, so that they wouldn't mix, and then doing the acid etching process to the lithostones, and it was creating these natural backgrounds. Steve, do you have that right? Do I have that right? Do you want to comment on that? Okay. Mr.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
that's right. That's true. Well, that's my guess. You'd have to be there to really know, but I mean, it's sure my experiments look a lot like this.
Oh, good.
I mean, not as good as that, but
Yeah. Steve is a sign painting friend, and he's gotten into poster design as well. Now that he's kind of retired from signs, he's doing more and more poster work, but he has been for decades here in Santa Cruz, and he's very influenced by Holbein and our next artist, which is Lucien Bernhard. So two more Holbeins, just to give you an idea of the flavor of what was going on and the simplicity that was happening compared to the flowery Art Nouveau style of poster that this was supplanting. So here's Bernhard, and I could go into long stories about Lucien Bernhard, really one of my favorites, really influential, but we'll keep this short. There is a big story about him in a past alphabet. You'll recognize the cover in a second, but he was the one in 1903 who started the movement in poster design called the Sac Plakat, the object poster, whereas flowery text and flowery decoration was the order of the day. He came in, and the Sac Plakat is picture of the product and the name of the product. So his most famous one is the Priester matches. This is the one that represents it, although this did not happen in 1903 or 1906, which is what you will still find in history books or history websites about this. There was a story written in the 1980s by Stephen Heller that perpetuated the myth that Bernhard himself probably started. But this poster was done in 1915 after he had been a success for more than 10 years, and he was commemorating the first poster, and this was the first poster. Supposedly, the story is, really quickly, that was an entry into a poster competition for Priester matches, and that he came in and did this totally simple one, like the one at the bottom, with the name of the matches and a picture of the matches, and it was rejected by the judges by being thrown in the trash. And then when the head judge showed up, he pulled it out of the trash, called the other judges idiots, and said it won the competition. And like, it happened overnight. It was an instant thing. But you can see here from the real thing that it was not instantaneous. The original poster did have the box of matches and a longer name, as well as some extra copy. And as they simplified this in steps, first of all, they just cut off the left side of the poster So it became this. Then they decided they didn't need this copy, and it became that. So it was a slower evolution, and it wasn't this automatic thing that happened. But that is still being perpetuated. I looked up Bernhard 2 days ago on the web, and I found a connection, a link to a um, Antiques Roadshow episode where they were talking about Lucian Bernhard, and the guy who was the expert pulled out a picture of this and held it up and said, this was designed in 1906 and changed the poster design world forever. And like instantaneously. So he was still, believing this, the myth that Stephen Heller was perpetuating. No matter how he got there, the fact of the matter was that he was this simplicity. He was the first one to make this simplicity popular, and it changed everything. And he was brilliant with color and really clever. He was a funny guy. When you read interviews with him, he's always clowning around about stuff. And look how brilliant the one in the top left, top right, is for caffeine-free coffee. The snake being the caffeine and the coffee beans. And as he went along, he started to put detail back into these things and a representation of three-dimensionality, but kept the simplicity of the composition. And that's why it's so brilliant. He came to the United States in the 1920s and kept his atelier open in Berlin with an associate running that. So he was one of the first international design companies, and you can just see how wonderful it is. This hard edge, not hard edge, but broken edge or rough edge poster lettering was a hallmark of his early posters, and you can see from this poster that it influenced this typeface that came out. The first weight of this typeface came out in 1908, where they just copied him directly. And he didn't get upset about it. He just thought, maybe I better get into type design. So the first thing that he designed was this Bernhard Antiqua family. And the most recognizable font from the family would be this letter in white. The condensed version of it was something that there were Letraset press type. You could get this for a long time. And I used to love it for sign painting because it was rough and easy, and you didn't have to be exact. The serifs were really soft, so you could paint this quickly, and while it was still a powerful one. He designed a black letter typeface, a fraktur, and the heavyweight of this, I've always loved, this is an example of his humor. He called this the tuba in the Fraktur orchestra. And then here is that script, this poster script typeface we used. This was on the cover of Alphabet. So if you're looking through your alphabets, if you happen to keep any, if you have this one, Bernhard's story is in there. Steve and I bought this type together, by the way. And neither of us have presses, and it's never been printed since we bought it, but we do have this type. If you want to come to Santa Cruz and bring your press, you could use it. Once he moved to the United States, he started to design more sophisticated typefaces. And so the smoothness and the more delicate serifs, etc., were the departure from his poster style lettering that reflected the early designs. The one in the top middle, Bernhard Modern, you'll probably recognize. He's easy to find because he almost always has his last name in front of the name of the type. Bernhard Tango, Bernhard Modern, Bernhard Gothic. It's great stuff. And the interesting thing was he never did text faces. He thought that those had been done to perfection already, and he viewed display typefaces as a stylistic thing that was going to change. So he figured that he could keep designing display typefaces, like they were new songs coming out by a musician or something, that he could continue to flood the market, and he didn't expect them to last, but they have lasted. And I know I've told this story before, but I was watching a documentary movie once of events that happened in the 40s and 50s. And you know how they like to put throw newspapers on the screen to reflect the headlines of the day. And they put a newspaper down that had Bernhard Gothic as the headlines. And I was just, hey, that's Bernhard Gothic. You know, it was just really exciting. I wish I had taken a picture of it or could remember what the movie was, because it was galvanizing to see. So his partner in Germany was Fritz Rosen, the one who stayed in the atelier in Berlin was named Fritz Rosen. And so if you ever see Bernhard posters, his famous signature is Bern over hard. But if anything is added to it, it'll either say atelier or sometimes Rosen over the Bernhard, then you know that Rosen designed it. So these are two logos and a poster that Rosen designed for Bernhard's atelier. And Bernhard had a really great thing to say about that. He said that he trusted Rosen implicitly and he understood his style, and that some of Bernhard's very best ideas were Rosen's. So before we get to the big connection we're going to be making is between this particular letter style that Wes Wilson used in his posters. In fact, all of them did, but not to the extent that Wes Wilson did, and its origin in the Vienna Secessionists. But before we get to that, here's the Vienna Secessionists, and this is the poster that started this letter style that is totally identified with the psychedelic 60s, but it happened in 1903, same year that Bernhard entered the Priester Matches competition, by the way. The Vienna Secessionists were a group of artists in Vienna, of course, that felt that the Association of Austrian Artists was too conservative, both in their old-fashioned art that they were showing, as well as their nationalism. And the secessionists wanted to have a little bit more interaction with international artists, probably mostly around Europe, of course, but elsewhere. So they seceded from this. Hello? Yeah.
Marianne White wanted to know what was the word on the Rosen cow margarine logo.
The word, well, I can't really make this out. This is a picture taken from one of Steve's old books, so it probably was not a full page illustration, but it probably says Atelier Bernhard in the signature. Is that what you're talking about, Marianne?
I thought the cow spots spelled the word.
Yes,
Yeah,
it is. That's true. Yeah, it is GEG. Right, Steve, what does that stand for?
Something having to do with margarine, maybe the maker of the margarine or the farm where it comes from, or the association with milk or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought you might know it more specifically. My impression was that it was a larger food company and that this was just one of the things that they offered. But GEG, and the logo is not that sloppy, but it is these obviously Bernhard designed lowercase g's is the logo. So there's a smoother version of this, but they were trying to make it look like the spots on the cow. I forgot completely that there was another word in here that we weren't looking at. Thanks, Marianne. Okay, so back to the secessionists. They wanted to start their own organization. And so get this, they wanted to draw a really sharp line between them and the Association of Austrian Artists. So they named their new association the Union of Austrian Artists. Very distinct difference. But they came to be known as the Vienna Secessionists because they, in their posters and those kind of things, they featured this word secession so largely. So this is one of the main poster designers for this group of artists. And these artists they were fine artists, sculptors, architects, graphic designers. There were 50 people in the founding members. There were 50 of them. And Gustav Klimt was their first president. Egon Schiele was another member. Alphonse Mucha was an early member also of the Vienna Secessionists, even though he was in Paris. That was part of them attracting an international membership. This was 1897. And Rohrs was one of the two big poster designers for them. And this letter style here is what Wes Wilson was copying for all of those psychedelic posters in San Francisco, 63 years later. And the interesting thing here is that Rohrs used this on one poster, just one poster, and he also did it in the calendar you'll see in a minute. And Wes Wilson did dozens of posters using this letter style, but it came from that. So this is something I found online, this graphic I found online, where they were talking about some of the secessionist members and what was represented by the posters. Joseph Hoffman and Gustav Klimt. Koloman Mosher is the poster designer for this. This appears to be something very inspired by Macintosh, if not Macintosh himself. Actually, it looks like it is signed Charles Rennie Macintosh down at the bottom. So he must have been part of the association at some point as well. One of the things they did right away, they formed in 1897 and built this building immediately. It was designed by Joseph Maria Ulbrich, who also designed the poster on the left representing the building. This was their exhibition hall. So it was their, people could come see the work of their members and what was featured there. And a sad part about this is that when the Nazis invaded Austria in the 30s, one of the very first things they did was tear this building down because it represented degenerate art to them, and destroyed the building. And as soon as the war was over, the Austrians built this building again. So that color picture at the bottom right is a modern day, a picture of the modern day building, whereas the one on the top is a photograph from the first decade of the 20th century, probably. And it was featured on coins before the euro became the monetary unit of the European Union. It was on Austrian money as well. One of the very first exhibitions they had there was some sort of show where the artwork pertained to Beethoven. And there was a big sculpture in the middle of this room by Max Klinger, and Gustav Klimt painted this mural right on the walls, this frieze right on the walls surrounding this sculpture. And when it was over, a wealthy patron of Klimt's went to great expense to have it taken off the wall and preserved. And it's a long story about its ownership, but it has made its way back to the Secessionist Hall in the basement and is there to this day. It looks like I spelled secessionist wrong in the captions here. Sorry about that. Egon Schiele was another secessionist, and I thought we'd take a little side trip here while we're here, because the letter style that we're seeing on the left is, of course, very much like the typeface Neuland. But I believe that Neuland was born from the poster on the right, which is from 1907, also by a member of the Secessionists, Oskar Kokoschka, who was a playwright, and most of the graphics that he did was advertising his plays, which is what this is. And this is the first place that I think we see Neuland-style lettering, and it came to represent the German Expressionists. And Rudolf Koch, who was just beginning his type design career when this poster came out, he drew his typefaces for the next 15 years, and he would just hand it off to the Klingspor foundries punch cutters, in the basement, give him the drawings for the type, and they would do all the work. So, and he said in many places that his type was a partnership between him and the punch cutters. But by 1920, he decided that he wanted to know what punch cutting was like. So Neuland was the letter style that he chose to make his first typeface. But the letter style itself was at least 15 years older than that. So here's famous Neuland. We know Neuland
Carl?
as, yes.
Excuse me,
Sure.
Trish Meyer said Letterform Archive has an excellent new book on this era.
We'll talk about that.
Okay,
It's called Die Flagge.
yes.
All right. So we know Neuland, probably, during our lifetime, we would have seen it as photo lettering. And with photo lettering, they would have just taken one point size, made negatives of that, and headlines were set using film strips and this is before computers. And then when computers came along, we would have just taken those same letters and created digital fonts from those. So we probably know just a limited amount of these letters. But the wonderful thing about Neuland was that when Koch would do a drawing for, say, a black letter typeface or a Roman typeface and send it downstairs to the punch cutters, they would faithfully, carefully reproduce that in every point size that that the company decided to make metal type for. And so it was a painstaking thing, and they were very careful about it. But Koch, when he started to do Neuland, he made things super easy on himself by not being careful about it, that he just started to freeform the letters in the punch cuts. And remember, when we're talking about punch cutting, to make these letters, you're trying to make a stand-up letter. So the way they're formed is by cutting the background away in steel at the actual size, 10 point, 12 point, 14, 24, 28, 36. So Colt just went in and made the first expressionistic typeface. And what I've got here are 5 different point sizes, so that you can see that the letters are substantially different from point size to point size. And you can see how freeform Koch was being when he was cutting these punches. So he was, one, making, going to new land. That's what Neuland means, a frontier. It was a frontier for him because he had never cut punches before, but it was also that it was so expressive, that he was making type as an artistic expressionist, gesture. But it was also so much easier that he could come in and just freeform it rather than be as demanding on himself as his bosses were on the punch cutters at the Klingspor. And Koch only did cut the punches for 3 typefaces: this, Peter Jessen Schrift, and Marathon. There's a big story on the Neuland type in the alphabet that had the laser cut cover, the black issue from 2015. If you still have that issue, you could read more about this. So here, let's just stick our nose one more time into the roller lettering that, again, was the only place that he did these letters. Here's a few pictures of Roller. Doesn't he look like he'd be friends of ours? And some more Roller lettering. And these are more normally constructed. The thing about these letters, of course, is that really the way you build them is to draw the lines that are the negative shapes, the negative spaces between the letters, the counter spaces inside the letters. Those are what you draw from the rectangle that you delineate by, I've got a little illustration of how you'd approach doing these kinds of letters. So it's like you're drawing the negative areas to create the positive. Whereas most lettering, of course, is you're drawing the positive. And Roller did that in all the other posters that we can access from this stuff. So here's a softened, deco-y looking letter. Versacrum was the secessionist magazine. Versacrum means silent spring in Latin. And I was trying to figure out what this other poster said for the longest time. What is this German word that I can't even pronounce? Schleut. And it turns out that that's a man's name. So this was an exhibition of this man's work, but Roller designed the poster for that. And it has a rock and roll kind of flavor, especially to the man's name at the top there. Roller, by the way, married one of his students. So Mileva Roller was part of the Secessionists, and here are two pieces of her work. In the De Flaka book, it mentions that the women that were in the Secessionists, they showed an aptitude for wood carving. So a lot of the woodcut prints were made by women, and Mileva Roller's woodcut below the caption there is one of them. And the other one is a sketch for some sort of a comp for a poster that she designed. Notice how she's got a grid on it. So she may have been working from photographs. Mucha worked from photographs, put a grid on photographs for the figures in his work. Did any of you learn how to draw from a grid? I had a painting teacher who took us through that. And man, I used that in sign painting whenever I had illustrations to do and I wanted them to be big. You could also use it to distort stuff. Working from a grid is so great because the idea is that you just have to reproduce one square at a time, so it takes care of proportion and things looking like your source material. It's a wonderful thing. Turned out to be a really important part of my education. So here's another, this is another one of the poster artists from the Secessionists. I took a picture of this poster in Hamburg on a trip once. There's a wonderful arts and crafts museum right across from the main train station in Hamburg. So if you ever find yourself in Hamburg, the first place you want to go to when you get off the train is the Arts and Crafts Museum. And they had a fantastic poster show that had the Roller poster and this Born poster, more psychedelic. And you could see this same kind of vertical square look, although these are much more formed letters. And then these are pages from De Flaka, Trish, and you can see that same poster design was reproduced in the book, as well as a couple of roller posters in this blue and red color scheme. So I figured that that's a signature in the book that they were mechanically printing these two colors, and they weren't wedded to the colors of the poster, but same artwork. So both of these are by Baum, and see how they were always advertising for themselves. Probably advertising exhibitions that were happening at the Secessionist Exhibition Hall. And here's a blurry close-up of these beautiful letters by Baum. The other poster designer and lettering person in the Secessionists was Koloman Mosier. He's got kind of a MC Escher sort of thing going on here, but this would have been same time, maybe before Escher. And you can see his posters. They've got this monoline, speedball B series look to them. And in the 1990s, Paul Shaw and Garrett Bogue from, what is the name of the foundry? Letter Perfect Foundry. Garrett lives in Washington State, and Paul, of course, lives in New York City, but they designed some typefaces that were historical references. And one of them was called Colo, obviously using Coleman Mosier's lettering from his posters as inspiration. And here's a couple of Roller's reproductions in De Flaka. And De Flaka is a reproduction of this book that the Secessionists put out back in that time period. And the only other place that we'll see the Wes Wilson style letters from Roller himself was from the calendar that Versacrum put out, the Secessionists put out in 1903. So we're getting ready to make this connection to the San Francisco guys, but I want to show you two psychedelic artists from the 1920s. This is Hans Thaddeus Hoyer. All the work you're going to see here is also in that same issue of Alphabet that had the Bernhard story. And uh, Hoyer was a lettering artist in, I think his main place was Berlin, is where he settled down and worked, did most of his career. And he did traditional lettering that he then pushed to psychedelic limits. This is the cover of the calligraphy issue of Grabowsgraphic magazine. And this is a drop cap from one of the many books that he did the lettering for. And this typeface is actually based on his letters, although it was designed by the publisher of these books. We'll talk about that in a second. The books are called, the publisher was Officina Serpentis. And he just had this totally elaborate, wonderfully detailed, crazy psychedelic look. The lettering on the right is from Officina Serpentis's edition of Dante's La Commedia. And they had 3 full-page illustrations of the 3 sections. This is Purgatorio, Il Purgatorio, and Inferno, and the one we're going to see in a moment, the best one is Paradiso. The thing on the left is a New Year's card. And this is a case where all this work that we're seeing, Hoyer designed, but it was cut in wood by Bruno Rollitz, a man named Bruno Rollitz, who, again, just like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Rollitz was doing the same kind of work that Hoyer was doing, but Hoyer was leading. It's just that Rollitz was doing it, you know, in heels going backwards, because he had to cut these things out in wood in reverse so that they would print positive. And here's Paradiso, Il Paradiso, just the most psychedelic thing I've ever seen. I keep meaning, I've been threatening myself to do a paper cut of this one of these days. I'll make it gigantic and you know, glue it down. Howard Glasser had a great technique for paper cuts where he would put rubber cement on the back of his paper and glue it down to another surface so that when he cut out the black paper, he could pull it out and it would stay in place. The rubber cement kept it in place without it being a permanent adhesion. So one of these days I'll do that. You know, I'm going to close the window. The gardeners are here. Sorry about that. It's Wednesday. And there's the Officina Serpentis logo down below. You can see the O and the S in the snake there. Just such a cool design. And then the other psychedelic crazy man from the 1920s was Archibald Knox. And Knox is famous for the metal work that he did for Liberty, the luxury department stores in London. He did lots and lots of jewelry design, and then things like clocks and lamps, that kind of stuff. So he is famous for his Art Nouveau metal work. It's because it was in England, it had that kind of arts and crafts flavor to it. And he also taught in London, but he was born in the Isle of Man, which is the little isle off the west coast of England. And in 1912, 1913 or so, actually Knox lived from 1864 to 1933. And about 1912, 1913, his teaching, or the entire department at the school that he taught at, the Kingston School of Art, was criticized. And in a huff, he just quit and said, okay, screw it. And went back to the Isle of Man and spent the rest of his life, among other projects, working on this this thing called Deer's Cry. It was the St. Patrick's hymn. So some of you may know this prayer. It's a very long prayer, and he would just do one piece for each line of this prayer, and it's very long. So he spent he had started it while he did it as a meditation, as a kind of a prayer meditation, that he would do these illustrations. He started it in England, but when he quit, he left all his sketches there. In fact, he threw them away. I've got, yes, this next one. This is an actual watercolor from the V&A. It's in their collection at the V&A. And when he left his school and he was mad, he just took all the contents of his desk and threw them in the trash and went home to the Isle of Man. And one of his students pulled the stuff out of the trash and gave it to the Victorian and Albert Museum. So if you ask to see his work at the V&A, you can actually see the originals of this. But then he went to the Isle of Man and completed the, he never completed it actually. He worked on it until he died in 1933, and he still hadn't done all of them. And those originals are at the museum on the Isle of Man. And when I went to see it, I didn't write ahead of time. I just showed up, and they didn't let me see it because the work was off-site, and I needed to write them in advance. So let that be a lesson to you kids. If you're going to go to a museum and you want to see something specific, tell them you're coming, ask to see it, whether it's the Harrison or Letterform Archive or any of these other research libraries around the world. Let them know you're coming. So the connection here I want to make to the 60s is Roger Dean, who did all those Yes album covers, those British art rock bands from the mid 70s. Roger Dean was the one who did the lettering. And Dean has gone on record as saying that he was totally influenced by Rick Griffin, one of the San Francisco artists we're going to be talking about in a minute. But I've always seen a connection between his more organic style lettering and Knox's. So here's my favorite from the Deer's Cry. This says against. There's a great big against in the middle where the letters are stacked up on top of each other. The first letters are bigger and they're going smaller as they go on back. So if you want to check this out, when you see the recording, you can see the A, the G, the next to A, there's the I-N-S-T, against, and then the words that he's asking Christ to protect him against are poison, burning, drowning, wound, and death. Poison, burning, drowning, wound, and death. But Art Nouveau, arts and crafts, psychedelic, illegible as all get out. It's got everything. And one more piece of his, this says Christ protect me today. On a couple of the the plates that he did, he used a big X to stand in for the word Christ. So as devout a man as he was, maybe it's not so sacrilegious to spell Christmas with an X. Anyway, so finally, we're in San Francisco and we're at Wes Wilson. And the big connection between the past and the San Francisco poster designers is well established. Lots of these guys were using references to artworks from long before, but the most overt one is Wes Wilson using Rohrs lettering from that one poster, one Secessionist poster that Wes did all kinds of stuff with. And I remember this is an important kind of letter style for me when I was in high school, because you can figure out how to do this. I'm sure that if you hadn't thought about this before, you can see the structure and what it is. I have an illustration of it in a second. I guess I forget where I put it, but you can see that you're drawing the outside, you're just making a grid for the letters that you want. So if you have X amount of letters in a line, you draw a box and then divide that box into however many letters you've got in it, and then start drawing the counter spaces to create the letters. It's very easy, but look how wonderfully you can make things flow from this. So we'll get to that illustration in a second. But as long as we're talking about the psychedelic poster, the beginning of the psychedelic poster happened in Virginia City, Nevada, where there was a little a barroom scene going on up there. In fact, a lot of these people that started living in Nevada City moved to San Francisco and started the ballrooms down there. The Family Dog had their origins in Virginia City, and at the Red Dog Saloon, it was famous for the the nascent rock and roll scene that was starting to go up there. And the Charlatans were the first psychedelic band, or that first modern hippie San Francisco band. And this poster for a gig they had at the Red Dog was designed by the two of the members, Mike Ferguson and George Hunter, the two guys at the top. And Dan Hicks, by the way, was the drummer for the Charlatans. He was the charlatan who went on to the most fame and success after he left, but he was the drummer for the Charlatans. And the San Francisco historians call this poster the seed, because it was the one that all subsequent posters flowed from. But you can see how Victorian, how, Old West, these guys were approaching stuff. Look at the clothes that they're wearing, even being drawn here, but that is what they wore in real life. So they were Victorian dandies. And so they were looking back at Victorian style decoration for this. And we're going to take our first look at Rick Griffin here. And the San Francisco poster artists, one of the seminal events from that time period, this is the first month of 1967, was the Human Being in Kezar Stadium, right there at the end of Haight Street, and the Polo Grounds. I'm sorry, not Kezar Stadium, but Polo Grounds in Golden Gate Park. They had this gigantic scene, and all the poster artists from that time did separate posters for it. I've only got Rick's in here, but you can see that Rick is approaching this like a wanted poster, in that he's got Old West lettering that changes from, feature to feature. In this case, the featured speakers for the event, and changing it. So he was influenced by Western poster design, but it's got this psychedelic flow. And Rick brought this kind of stuff up from his the early part of his career, which was as a cartoonist for Surfer magazine. And we'll see that later. But you can see here that this Victorian style, this Western style, was very influential at the first part of psychedelic posters. And lots of people did these posters, but right away, these five artists jumped out ahead of the rest of them, and they were known as the Big Five. So from left to right, it's Alton Kelly, Victor Moscoso, Rick Griffin, Wes Wilson, and Stanley Mouse. We're going to jump forward here 20 years to in 1987, when there were a lot of celebrations of the Summer of Love. They've got the five together again, and so left to right, it's Wes and Kelly and Mouse and Victor and Rick. And we're also going to look 20 years on to a poster by Victor and a poster by Rick, when they were both celebrating this 20th anniversary of the Summer of Love, and the artwork that happened there. Look at the wallpaper behind them. It's all those posters from this time period, just like the exhibitions in Munich and in New York that we saw at the start of the show. And one of the things I want to show you before we get back into the 60s is the original artwork for Rick's poster from 1987. And he's depicting Jimi Hendrix, at the Monterey Pop Festival, lighting his guitar on fire. And I wanted you to see how beautiful this drawing was, because I don't think Rick did himself a favor by making the image negative on the actual printed poster. Look how much it looks like Jimmy in the positive here, and the stylized drawing. He was a master draftsman. We'll see more of that. But meanwhile, yes.
Did Wes Wilson, Elizabeth L. wants to know, did Wes Wilson make a poster for Levi's, or is that by an imitator?
Very well could have been him. There's no reason that Levi's, which is a San Francisco company, wouldn't have approached those artists in those days. I know that Mouse and Kelly both did Levi's posters. So I can't picture a Levi's one that Wes had done, but it's much more likely, let's say 80%, that it probably was Wes rather than an imitator. But it was an easily imitatable style to to do that. And it's interesting to get that question right now when we're showing a poster that was influenced by Wes. But this is the woman who, when I did the story on David Singer in the last issue of Alphabet, the issue before last, I called David the sixth five, like he was the one who should have joined the big five. But really, the person who would get there first would be Bonnie McLean, because she did lots and lots of different posters in lots of different styles. So here she is working in Wes's style just for fun. She did lots of different style stuff. Here's a later one that has chalkboard looking calligraphy, because she was the person who did the announcements drawn on the chalkboard at the top of the stairs of the Fillmore. When the Fillmore was a ballroom that was on the second floor of this building. So you had to walk up the stairs to go to the dances, and there was a chalkboard, and Bonnie did all that work. So Bonnie worked at the Fillmore with Bill Graham and ended up marrying Bill Graham. And so you can just imagine how much of the work she did to run the Fillmore, as well as all this poster design. So she was the silent MVP of those days, and did lots of wonderful stuff. But here's Wes, and one of the things I meant to do this morning, and I didn't get around to it, I was adding other things, last minute additions to the show, was to go into my reference books and count how many of these posters that Wes did using Rohrs' letter style. And remember, Roller only used it once, and Wilson did it dozens and dozens of times, but it was pretty effective. And here's the way it works. That you could just draw a shape, count the number of letters that you want, and divide that shape into those that many cells, and then come in and draw the negative shape. I did this really quickly with a pointed brush and my patented shaky hand last night to show you how this worked. In the last time I showed this show, I was just trying to describe it, but this is the way it works. So you can see that Wes could just start with dividing the poster in half and then counting as many lines as he needed to have for the information that had to be on the poster, and then counting the letters. And so you're just dividing up all these little spaces. If it's an even number of letters in a line, you draw a line right in the middle of it. If it's an odd number, you draw a box in the middle and then work out from there. It's kind of like centering stuff on a typewriter. And then, so it's so accessible to draw this way. But I've got a couple here. On the left is the simpler way of drafting these letters. But on the right, and both of these are by Wes, the one on the right makes it look like the letters themselves were being drafted and not the negative space in between. He could have started his sketch by using this way of laying it out, but then for a change, he came in and he drew the contour of the letters so that they're not as delineated by the hard line of the negative area, because he was drawing the positive here. So he could do that. And he did other styles of letter, but there were so many of the posters that were using the roller style. It's kind of amazing. So here's the finished poster on the left. And they used to print the tickets to the show on the same print run as the posters. So the one on the right shows one of the posters that was pulled out of the print run before they printed the purple. And it also shows the tickets on the same piece of paper, same piece of stock as the poster itself. So the type design revolution in the 1980s and 1990s, when digital type started to be coming out, several different versions of the Wes Wilson or the Alfred Roller letters typefaces were designed in this style, but they always pointed at San Francisco, not at Vienna. And by the names is how you do that. So Jim Parkinson, he's the man who designed the current Rolling Stone logo. Rick Griffin designed the original one, by the way, but they only used it for 10 years. But Jim Parkinson is a type designer. He lives in Oakland, and he did one for Adobe Systems called Mojo. This is Mojo. And then there were two designed by Leslie Cabarga, who is a really prolific graphic design author and type designer. He's got his fingers in all kinds of stuff. But he designed two of them. One was called Love, and the next one we'll see is called Peace. So here's the typeface itself at the top, and then this is the back of a CD with the track listing using the typeface, but being distorted in Illustrator somehow. And then here's Peace, and Peace had, both Peace and Love had different permutations. In this case, at the top, we're seeing the outline, what's called the outline version. And then in the center, it says Peace Solid, which is shown lower right. And then lower left is Peace Open. And the hilarious thing here is that because there's no lowercase, they, in this case, in Peace's case, in all of these weights, they gave you the choice of having the capitals were sort of leaning backwards, and the lowercase is leaning forwards. And it's not meant to be used as capitals and lowercase. It's just meant to give you two ways of using the typeface. But online, this is right from the website of whoever was selling these things. They had used capital P, capital O, capital P, capital S, and then the lowercase letters for the rest of it. So you can see they don't fit together, and they are made to fit together. So this is a big screw up by whoever was laying out the display of the typeface for the website at the type company. Pretty funny. And you know, you'd think that if Leslie saw this, he'd say, you know, maybe we should talk to Larry, you know, downstairs in the advertising department and point out how this typeface works. So here's a modern poster designer from Portland named Gary Houston. His company is called Voodoo Catbox, and does lots and lots of great stuff. He loves a woodcut look. I think he uses linoleum blocks. We'll see that in the next slide. But I wanted to show you his modern day take on the roller lettering up at the top for the Ben Harper, and how angular it is, but it's the same concept. Although then he's outlined the counter spaces, and but especially this really appealing angularity to it. And here's two posters by Gary that show, you know, kind of representative of what he does, because he likes to have this woodcut kind of look. I'm not sure if all of these are actually lino cuts or woodcuts, or if he's just taught himself to draw so that it looks like they're woodcuts. I would think it would be easier to get a piece of linoleum and cut this rather than to draw it with ink on paper to look like it's a, you know, a cutaway kind of a look. But does lots of different stuff. We'll show you one more piece of his when we get to Rick Griffin's section. But one of our own friends here has recently embraced the roller style lettering. That's Amity Parks, and she's been teaching workshops in it. We had her talk about this a little bit when I gave this presentation to the Black Letter Brunch, but you can see how, you know, she's embracing the same thing, and it's created the same way. Although once you start drawing the negative areas, you can stylize it however you want. So she's knocking the corners off in both of these examples, where she kept it sharp here on this one, and then this one last one. So she's doing beautiful stuff with it, and you know, showing off her sense of color. It's really a lot of fun. So if you go to her Instagram page or Facebook page, you'll see a lot more of this kind of work. So now we got, just for the rest of the show, we have this portfolio of the psychedelic, the San Francisco poster artists. So we're going to start with Stanley, because he's kind of, along with Wes, he was the one there first doing this kind of work. Rick and Victor came later. In fact, Rick was attracted to San Francisco by the work of Stanley Mouse. So we'll talk about that when we get to Rick. So Stanley is probably most famous for taking this illustration by Sullivan for the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam, taking this illustration and putting color to it and putting it for this Grateful Dead poster. And it is the image that the Grateful Dead used for the rest of their career, Skulls and Roses. It came from this appropriated illustration from 1900. So even Stanley was going back and grabbing work from that time period too. And this isn't the only place that he had this. So this is a very early poster, and one of the ones that you can get lots of money for if it's in good shape and it's a first printing. I live in a little townhouse association, and a really good friend of mine lived right across the driveway from me. In fact, he's the one who alerted me to this place coming up for sale. He's gone now, but he had an original copy of this, and he showed me that right about in here, in the pale blue halftone that's happening, there's a place where the printing closed up, and there's a few printing dots that are melded together. And it's the giveaway as to whether or not it's a first printing or not. And that can make the difference between thousands and hundreds of dollars. You know, a later printing might be worth $100 or $200, whereas this you could get, you know, $2 or $3 or $4 grand for now if it's a first edition. And he had one. And Stanley, like Rick, was famous in a whole nother realm of visual art before he got to San Francisco. You know, these youth movements. In the 60s, I don't know if you remember Ed Big Daddy Roth and Rat Fink, and you could buy little car model kits. Since most of the audience is women, I suppose it's less likely that you were making outlandish monster car models when you were kids, but some of the boys may have. And Stanley worked for Roth, and he came up with this character on the left. The three illustrations on the left are is this guy named Freddie Flypogger, who had these gigantic teeth and bulging eyeballs, and the stick shift with the 8-ball on the end that was, you know, outlandishly long, that came outside this big cartoony thing. And Roth took the idea of the look of Freddie Flypogger and put ears and a tail on it and called it Rat Fink. And there were, you know, it became gigantically famous, but it came from Stanley Mouse. And then Stan ended up in San Francisco and started doing the posters, part of the family dog, and he and Alton Kelly. So it goes back to the very early days, 1966. This is the first Grateful Dead album cover. And I belong to a group of sign painters called the Letterheads. And the Letterheads really love this first album because we all know where he got these letters, which was a book from 1910 called Strong's Book of Designs. And it was one of the alphabets that was in the back that was, you know, and these are the kind of books that were put out for decorative artists and sign painters to use as inspiration books. And it was loaded with alphabets in the back. And we can see that Stanley used these letters. He lightened them up a little bit, but look at that E, you know, there's just no question. The D, all of these things, that this came from Strong's Book of Designs. And there were you know, historical accounts of these days where Stan and Rick and Kelly talked about going to the San Francisco Public Library, the main San Francisco Public Library, and looking at old source books for lettering work. So maybe there was a Strong's Book of Designs in the San Francisco Public Library at that time. It's so interesting to think of them going in through those same doors that Susie went in and out of every day, and that they were getting this inspiration from that time period. But Stanley was the one who came up with this elongated, spindly looking, spidery psychedelic letter. This is the quintessential psychedelic letter, you know, alongside the roller style lettering from Wes Wilson. And this is the original art at the top right, and at the bottom was the printed poster. This is a a fundraising event for the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and I loved that they called it Busted, and they used this picture of Buster Keaton in it. But Stan, he definitely repeated himself, but he moved around quite a bit. There are lots of posters and album covers that have cousins of this letter style, but look at this one, how psychedelic it is, but it's got that Western poster kind of look on this, circular banner type thing that's going around this old illustration. And they used lots and lots of collage stuff where they used old photographs and illustrations from other places. Although they could draw just fine, they had to crank these things out because, they only got $100 a piece for these posters throughout the 60s, from the time they started in late 66 up through the time, let's say, that the Fillmore closed in 1971. $100 was all these artists got. So even though they threw themselves into it, they still had to think about being expedient about it. So if they had some provocative illustration that they could use and it meant they didn't have to draw it, they could just slap it in there, then they went ahead and did that. So here is Lombardic Versals in a psychedelic poster, also by Stanley Mouse. And Stan and Kelly ended up being artistic partners. They shared a studio from the 60s all the way up through the 1980s and did lots and lots of projects together. And from the posters that Kelly did by himself and the ones that Mouse did by himself, I would say that Mouse was the better lettering artist. So I would say that Mouse did the lettering here, but they both worked on it. So this is the American Beauty album cover for the Grateful Dead from, what was this, 1971, 1972, meant to look like it's some sort of marble inlay in a table, but it's all airbrush work and really one of my favorites. So here's a self-portrait of Mouse and Kelly. Stanley with an airbrush and Kelly with a pencil. And an interesting thing about Mouse was that he had to have a liver transplant in the 1990s. He's still alive and doing fine, so it was a success. But his liver transplant was not from his, profligate lifestyle. It was because he had been breathing atomized paint for all the time he was using an airbrush without a mask. And that's what caused his liver to fail, and he needed a transplant. And I just looked that up this morning to make sure that it wasn't just a myth that I had heard someplace. And I found an article that said that the Grateful Dead actually paid for his operation because he didn't have insurance. And it was 1993. And so it was a success, and he's still alive today. It's a good thing, and showed how great the Grateful Dead were about this. Speaking of the Grateful Dead, here's the album cover from, this would have been in 1975, the Grateful Dead at the Mars Hotel. And this is not the name of the album. It's just a random word that they stuck on here. And you know how psychedelic lettering was tough to read because of the deep drop shades and multiple outlines and the exotic forms of the letters, but they decided to take that to the nth degree here, and it says Ugly Rumors, but it's actually upside down and backwards. So you had to hold this up to a mirror upside down to be able to read it. And I flopped one here photographically for you so you could see what Rumors looks like, but they were just taking this obfuscation of lettering as far as they could. And then on the very next album cover they did for the Dead, they went the opposite psychedelic direction, which is to start taking information out of the letters. So they were trying to have the name of the band read as well, not quickly. I was going to say as quickly as possible. They weren't interested in how fast you read these things, that's for sure. But so there's a pencil sketch from Stan up in the upper left in a different style, but again, taking away parts of the letters, and then a different way of doing that here for this, what was the name of this album? Terrapin Station. This was the Turtle album. And then in the 80s, they did all of the album covers for Journey, and they usually included wings. I screwed up my courage and went and introduced myself to Stanley while I was editor of Alphabet in the end of 1990, early 1991, and went up and visited him at his studio. And he gave me a great big box of pencil sketches to use for the article. And it was just a double-page spread. Two spreads that was called Stanley Mouse's Sketchbook. So it was all his pencil drawings, although it looks like this eyeball here was ink, but otherwise mostly pencil sketches. And so Stan was featured in Alphabet more than 30 years ago. And at that same time, I found this in that box. It's an abstract letter that Stan wrote to somebody. So I put this on the correspondence page. If you go looking for this this issue, it's got the reddish cover with Peter Thornton's Alphabet on the cover. It's red and black. If you want to read about Stan in 1991. So one last Stanley image. This is for the modern band called Moon Alice. This is from 2013. And Moon Alice is this band still in existence that every time they do a gig, the band themselves commissions a poster. And they've done 1,300 shows. So there are 1,300 posters designed for Moon Alice gigs out there. Stan only did a handful of them. He also did one of their album covers, but this is one of the ones when Moon Alice played at Hardly Strictly Bluegrass in Golden Gate Park. And the reason I'm stopping with this on Stan's section is that it's got a flying eyeball. And one of the most famous images in the psychedelic poster canon is the flying eyeball of Rick Griffin. So whenever Stan does it, and you can see here, we'll go back, this is whoops. Hey, come on. How do I get out of this? Oh, there we are. So whenever you see a winged eyeball, Stanley is pointing at Rick. So here is the famous Jimi Hendrix poster designed by Rick Griffin. This would have been 1968, I'm almost positive, 1968. And they had the same lineup of bands all week at the Fillmore, and then on the weekend they took the show to Winterland, which wasn't that far away from the original Fillmore. And this flying eyeball by Rick Griffin is one of the iconic, just like with Stan's first Grateful Dead poster. This is right there at the top in the history of poster design. But Rick did not come up with the flying eyeball. It came from Von Dutch. I know some of you've probably heard the name Von Dutch because he was a clothing brand 20 years ago. It's still around, but it's not the big sensation that it was in the 20s, in the early 2000s. And Von Dutch himself was a car pinstriper and made chopped hot rods and stuff. So here he is on the right with a hand airbrushed shirt, and he's got sign painter or pinstripers pinstriping daggers coming out of his ears, as well as his third eyeball. And then the original flying eyeball is on the left. And he's famous for having painted that on the dashboard, the metal dashboard of a car. And Rick saw this flying eyeball and put it in this poster and immortalized it. But it came from Von Dutch, another lowbrow art source for these things. This, by the way, is a close-up of one of the letters that came from a painting of the original poster. And if we go back and look here at this, you'll see that this is just pen and ink. So it's one of these J's. It's the top J in Jimi Hendrix. And they painted a 6-foot-tall version of this poster. And remember when Tower Records used to have those great big airbrushed album covers on the side of the wall, right there at Columbus and whatever it is, down near Fisherman's Wharf? The team that used to reproduce those album covers, and they were all hand painted and airbrushed, they did the rough version of the Jimi Hendrix poster, the flying eyeball poster, and then Rick came in and did the detail. So look at this gorgeous detail. So this letter probably would have been, 6 inches tall rather than the tiny one he would have drawn on the poster. Now, Rick, like Stanley had a career. His career started while he was in high school. He came up with the the Surfing Everyman, Murphy. It was a comic strip that was in Surfer magazine, every issue, back in the early 60s. So this would have been, it's signed 1961 here. Rick designed this, and he was still in high school when he was doing this. So I lived in Southern California at this time. I was 10 years old in 1961. So 62, 63, I started copying Rick Griffin's style of cartooning. I learned to draw copying Rick Griffin. So he goes back that far in my life. And after a few years in Southern California, he went to art school at Chenard. All of a sudden, he ended up in San Francisco too. And I've told this story before. It's kind of pathetic, but I was in a record store and I saw this album cover, and light bulbs went off in my mind when I looked at this, and I realized that I could recognize Rick Griffin's line in this new style of lettering. And by then I was, of course, into, rock and roll and the posters and that kind of stuff, but I didn't know that Rick was up there doing that. So when I saw this, there was some sort of realization that I had an eye or an appreciation of this kind of stuff, to be able to recognize his line and his cross hatching, the same stuff that he used to draw with Murphy, to see in this album cover was just a big moment in my life. And so here is one of Rick's posters from right in the middle of that time, with Stanley Mouse's spindly psychedelic style lettering that Rick has made his own. It's a little more angular, a little more spidery, deep drop shade, couple of outlines to make it hard to read. I talked to a friend of Rick's after he died, when I was first putting together. I've got a great big slideshow of Rick's work. The man's name was Jose Kent, and he said they were walking down the street in San Francisco one day, and they saw this image on a bag of cement. The heart and the torch was the logo on some sort of bag of cement. And I've looked for it. I've never seen anything like it. But the lettering is the big headline here. When they did a retrospective of Rick's career at the Laguna Art Museum in 2007, they called the exhibition Heart and Torch after this image. So in the early days, this is one of the very first posters that Rick designed for the family dog at the ballroom, Avalon Ballroom. And the way they worked in those days was Rick would do the drawing and take that to the printers with an overlay on top of it, calling out the colors that the printers would then strip in and make the 4 different plates for a full color look. So if they were only paying the artists $100 for these things, they didn't have an extra $300 or $400 to make a color separation for a poster this big, which is what it would have cost in those days. It's free now that we have computers, but then a photo separation was an expensive thing. So they would do what was called my brain freeze, a mechanical separation. And to start with, they were letting the printers do that for them. So Rick did this drawing, gave the drawing to the printers with an overlay, and this is something that Rick's widow, Ida Griffin, had, where Rick is calling out the colors, where he's just saying, okay, it's the regular warm red, but the blues and the yellows were mixtures. And then for the black, Rick made this up. He said East Algerian Afro Sundown Black. He just wanted a real black to go in there. But all these artists were unhappy with the lack of control over how the colors were being done, that somebody else was doing it for them. This is a poster by Rick's wife, Ida, done at the same time. And I showed this slideshow to my class back in May, and Ida and their daughter Adelia came to the class and talked about it. And after all of this time, I found out for the first time that Ida hates this green that ended up in this poster, because they were working with yellow and blue. So it was a 3-color print run, the black and the yellow and the blue, and they were using the yellow and the blue to create the green. And she said that when they got these posters back from the printers, they were just crushed because they thought the green was so ugly. I love olive green, so I've never had a problem with this, but it's one of those things. And that's why what Rick did after this time period, when he started to do his own mechanical separations, is nothing short of astonishing. So what he would do is do a drawing on, black and white on paper, a cartoon. He's using rapidograph pens and speedball pens to do these layouts, and then they would give that to the printer, and the printer would print them out blue lines. And blue lines, of course, would not be the blue image would not be seen by the copy camera. So they could take these blue lines that were the actual size of the artwork and come in and draw black on them for the colors that were going to be reproduced. So we're looking at the blue plate for this 3-color poster, because there was no black in this one. It was just red and blue and yellow to make all these colors. So we're obviously looking at this blue background here. Here's another really early one of Rick's, just made for head shops. It wasn't a dance poster, but down here we have the yellow plate. So you can see that there was a red that would have had this blend in it, but the yellow is underneath it, and the yellow around the triangle of the illustration behind the tobacco. So the red plate would also have some black lettering on top of it. So they did all this drawing in black and tried to guess what the colors would mix like when they were set on top of each other with halftones. So that brown was created with, the yellow and the black and some red probably. So just a gigantic guessing game, but they got really good at it. And here's the epitome of it. I know you know this image. This was the Grateful Dead's 3rd album, but it started as a poster. So here's Rick's drawing. They would have taken that to the printers, got a blue line, and then come back in here and drawn by hand in black and white all of these colors. So there's a yellow plate and the red plate and a blue plate. All those greens are mixtures of those blues. They're using Zipatone, or those that adhesive stuff that has halftones on it. In this case, it's a graduated halftone for the blend in the sky. And this is it was such a success, or the image was so beautiful to the Dead from this poster, that they wanted to make it their next album cover. So they took out the lettering at the bottom where they showed the bands and the light show, and Rick did this name. And Rick loved palindromes so much that I'm almost certain that he named this album for them so that he could draw this palindrome. So it's known as Oxomoxua. And I don't know if Meredith showed up today because she saw this slideshow before, but she used to have a cat named Oxo, named after this. Her husband especially is a big Deadhead. So, but beautiful thing about this, you can see right here that he drew every color. So that red one, he drew it solid and then came in with an X-Acto knife and scraped it away to get the blend from the yellow to the red, as well as all of these dots, hand dots, like this with a rapidograph, most likely. And then the sign of his genius here is that the original artwork was so big that it wasn't big enough. I mean, that it was too big for one piece of Zipatone or Letratone or whatever brand he used. And this was a halftone on an adhesive sheet that you cut out with a knife and laid in place. So you'd put it down and then cut it out. And can you see this blue line right here and this wisp of smoke here and here? Those are the places where the 2 pieces of Zipatone are overlapping. And Rick knew he would not be able to make a seamless, join of those 2 places because the halftone is so fine. So he cut this wisp of smoke in the places where they overlapped. Just genius stuff. That he knew he had something he had to deal with, so he added a new design element to take care of it. So I just found this picture online a couple of months ago, and here's Rick sitting at the table with the Oxomoxua poster just being started. So there's the original of that. There's a art gallery up in Grass Valley called the Chambers Project, and they just recently did these new deluxe printings of the OXO poster. And here it is. They released it at the poster show in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park last fall, in October. And Hosmer and I went up, and so here I am with Rick's daughter Adelia and Rick's son Miles. And Miles was really involved in the reproduction of the new version of the OXO Moxo poster. And we're standing in front of a sign that I painted for Ida, and she's been taking it to, poster events. I guess I did this in about 1993 or 4. Hosmer's got another version of this. And I was so stunned to walk in and see that they were still using this sign 30 years later. And it's in great shape. And Miles said that he had to touch it up, but they're still using it. So here's, this is, again, I think I said that Rick had redesigned Stanley's psychedelic kind of lettering. And here's Gary Houston doing a Rick Griffin in a poster that he did for Soundgarden. And this butterfly has the Soundgarden positive, or, forwards on the left side and backwards on the right side to mirror the wings of the butterfly. But then the other bands are right side up on the right side and backwards on the left side. So a closer look at this. So Gary is one of those chameleons, that he just grew up, living and breathing these artists and became this kind of artist himself. And so he can do all of these things. It's kind of funny here. He's got the Monqui, who I guess is the promoter of the dance. Monqui presents, and the presents is positive on the right side, or forward on the right side, and the Monqui is positive on the left side, and the backwards are reversed like a checkerboard there. Plus he's got it mirrored on the bottom. So playing around with that idea all the way through. This is the poster that's known as the morning paper. And it's a Sunday comic strip that Rick did. Rather than do the one big central image and a headline for the band for a dance, Rick decided to revisit his roots and do a comic strip. And what's wild about this is that it doesn't really tell much of a story, or it's just an imagined story of this Mickey Mouse figure going through and with nonsense calligraphy. Actually, look, he's using a calligraphy pen here. Although this was probably drawn black letter, this would have maybe been a calligraphy thing. I'll show you some of that later. And R. Crumb was just putting out Zap Comics at this time, and he said that this poster was inspiration for him to realize that he did not have to tell a story with his comic strips. They could just be imagery. And not only that, at that point, the first 2 issues of Zap Comics were just R. Crumb. And at this point, he decided that he could invite other artists to be part of Zap Comics. And Rick was one of the very first to join R. Crumb, contributing to Zap Comics. And so here's Rick drawing the original of this. And I think the next slide is, can you see down here that there's an empty panel that Rick isn't drawing here? He said he got down to the bottom and he couldn't think of one more thing to do. So he asked Stanley to put in that panel. So at Rick's retrospective in Laguna in 2007, I got Stan to point at his panel in the original. But here are the hand inked blue lines that Rick did. So he had to do this for this elaborate comic strip. He had to do each of the colors by hand in black and white on the blue line. So we're looking at the blue plate on the left, and the yellow plate is down below it. This is in a display case at the poster shop called Art Rock. They were down south of Market. Boy, I took these pictures 15 years ago at the very least. And then the red plate on the right side. So you can see they had to do this for every one of these posters. And just to give you an idea of what kind of a draftsman he was with a pen, comic book art was where he started, and that was even most of his posters were done the same way, approached, drawn as cartoons, and then dealt with. And these are 2 comic strips that were surfing travelogues for an addition to Surfer magazine in the right around 1970. One was for a surfing trip to Mexico and one was to Maui. And just look how gorgeous his lettering was and his drawing. So amazing. This is one of my first, the cover for a news weekly we had back in, we had here in Santa Cruz back in the 1980s. This is my first one. And there was, this is a local story that I was assigned, but I totally channeled Rick on this one. That F comes right from the Mexico poster. Although the rest of it is calligraphy, early pointed brush, and then I used to use a bamboo pen with lots of pen manipulation for these kinds of capitals. And this was the same situation that Rick was in. I just gave the black and white artwork to the art director of the of the Express, and he made all the color choices and stripped in everything. So I didn't even know that it was going to be red and black. I mean, red and yellow. He chose to make that moire pattern in the background by having the two halftones, perpendicular to each other. That creates the moire. I was especially surprised and a little shocked that he put a red frame around this. I saw that as white the whole time, but but it happened. So I've always been influenced by Rick. So finally, in the 70s, the budget started to appear for these people to have enough money for color separation so they could start doing paintings and not have to do mechanical separations. They could do the paintings and have them color separated in the camera. So the first published thing of Rick's, or the first album cover at least, was the Grateful Dead's Wake of the Flood album cover. And again, this shows you how much freedom the Dead gave their artists. And Rick by then had become a born-again Christian. So he's turning the Grim Reaper into this gentle harvest. He called it a gentle harvest. So this is a portrait of the Grim Reaper, and not so, as a Christian, he's, heaven is waiting for you, right? So the skull that's in the cloud, and the imagery here. Here's the original pencil drawing for that. What an artist. Here's one of the few places where we can say for sure he used a calligraphy pen. He self-published a comic book, a really abstract comic book called Man from Utopia. And this 3-column example of, nonsense runic calligraphy is done with a pen, although the Passionetta is what the headline says, is drawn in his calligraphic style. But another one, you can see the pen work here. This is barrio calligraphy, and this is long before calligraphy, before graffiti was so ubiquitous. It was a strange, it was in the barrio sections of Southern California where Rick was living, and he adapted it for the lettering on the back of the Grateful Dead's Greatest Hits album, What a Long Strange Trip It's Been. And look how he's using 2 different sizes of speedball pen to have a bold and a lightweight version of this barrio graffiti as a pen-drawn letter style. If I get to do the next edition of the Speedball textbook, I don't know why I missed this opportunity to do it in the last one. I didn't think of it, but I'm going to try and get this in the next Speedball book as a lettering style there. So this is the album cover for that, and this wasn't in the slideshow until early this morning, when I thought we've got to get some black letter in the slideshow for Ward. And this really relates to me and Ward in that when I took these pictures, this is the published album cover. But when I was taking all the pictures at Ida's house and going in and interviewing other friends of Rick for the slideshow I made for the conference in '98 in San Diego, I did a great big story, evening presentation on Rick. I started to gather these things a step at a time, and Ida had this negative with shading in it, And you can see that this is straight line art on what was published in the album cover. And then I went to another guy's place, and he had the original artwork for this thing that had been airbrushed with a red to yellow fade in the lettering with these beveled edge letters. So this was the negative for printing from this original. I found this first and then this later. And I went to Ward with this and showed him this. And I said, Ward, have you ever seen an eye that was double dotted? And he said that he hadn't. And I was half hoping that I would see double dots in Ward's work after I showed him this piece. But I never noticed it if he did do that. But that did give us an excuse to put a little bit of Ward in the middle here. And I want you to look at that A. This was the new Atelier Gargoyle logo that he designed after he and Linnea moved to Half Moon Bay. And look how psychedelic that A is. Isn't that gorgeous? But all the letters are amazing. The H and the M are so danceable. Anyway, R.I.P. Ward. We miss you, buddy, already. Somebody posted, Bonnie Nora posted a movie last night of Ward demonstrating in class and talking in class, and it was just like, how could this forceful person be gone? Just so powerful. It's hard to imagine. Do any of you ever remember seeing Ward on the Academy Awards? I can't remember how long ago it was, but let's say 1990s or so. I'm watching the Academy Awards, and they had this little film clip that was sort of where they had real short little jump cuts from famous actors and people that weren't famous at all talking about movies. And all of a sudden, boom, Ward jumps up on the screen and he goes, gruff, uncompromising. And then they cut to somebody else. And you know how when you're on TV in a situation like that, you're going, man, that looked like Ward. But there was no doubt in my mind. I was going, that is Ward Dunham on the Academy Awards. It was, I wish I had a film clip of that. I'll bet you Linnea has that. And it turns out that some friend of theirs was involved in the making of this short that went in the Academy Awards. And they had Ward talking about a moment in a movie that he particularly liked and described it as gruff and uncompromising. So anyway, back to Rick. He did become a born-again Christian in the early 70s, and it was at a time when that was another youth movement in California, between the surfing movement that was gigantic in the early 60s, and then the psychedelic poster in San Francisco, and then this youth born-again movement in Southern California. And Rick became an artist at the forefront of that as well. He started working for Calvary Chapel, and they had music publications and print publications, and Rick did artwork for all of this stuff. And the amazing thing is that once he was able to start painting and not having to do things mechanically with pen and ink, his work got far more psychedelic than it even was when, you know, it was advertising the dancing and the drugs of the 60s in San Francisco. So this was an album cover of Christian music, Jesus, entering, what was it, Jerusalem on a donkey. And while he was painting this, the night he was painting this was the night that Leonard Skinner's plane went down, and Ronnie Van Zant and a couple other members of the band were killed. So Rick put this little skateboard kid in the crowd with a Leonard Skinner t-shirt on. And you have to kind of look for that, but it's a little Easter egg in this painting. This is one of the sketches that he did, and it was pretty big. This is, at least 3.5 feet wide. And it's butcher paper, and it's gouache, white gouache, and charcoal and ink, pen and ink on butcher paper as a warm-up for the lettering that went across the top of this. And it was so beautiful that they actually put this piece on the back cover of the album. And I owned this piece for a while. I bought it from Ida in the mid-90s, and then when I was scraping together the money to buy this townhouse, I sold it to a rich collector up in Portland and made a little money on it. But now that the money's gone, I certainly miss this piece. It's one of the most beautiful things he ever did. It's these Hebrew influenced letters with a beveled edge, and the shading is so gorgeous. Really lovely. So we'll end Rick's section with the one time that he did roller lettering, or the Wes Wilson lettering, was for an exhibition of his own work that he had at this small psychedelic gallery in New York City, the Psychedelic Solution on West 8th Street, which is right across the street from Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland Studios, by the way. And I had a really good friend, a guy who went to college here in Santa Cruz with my girlfriend at the time when we moved to New York so that she could be an actress. And it was on the second floor, right next door to the Psychedelic Solution. So even though you went in different doors, you walked up the stairs and they basically shared a wall. So one more coincidence. I'm friends with lots of Rick Griffin nuts. Before the internet came along, we had an email group called Forge, Friends of Rick Griffin, and one of them lived in Hawaii, but he had a house here near Steamer Lane in Santa Cruz, and his name was Murphy. Maybe his middle name was Murphy, or maybe he just adopted it. He was such a Rick Griffin fan, both psychedelic and surf related. And when he died, his widow asked me to design the lettering for their gravestones in Rick Griffin style. So this is what I came up with. It's kind of stiff, I know, but and I don't know if she got this finished. I just gave her the lettering that she would then take to the gravestone place and have it sandblasted. So one of these days I'll have to ask her if that ever made it into stone. We're nearing the end. I hope I'm not taking too long here. I am taking too long. Sorry. Victor Moscoso, another one of the big five, and his lettering was also huge for me in high school. It was this Western lettering, but I'd never seen this curve where these big serifs would cradle the round stroked letters. And that seemed very psychedelic to me and very accessible. So I started, this is another place where I was learning to draw letters long before I'd heard the word calligraphy. And even though Victor did not do the letters, this artwork for the album cover for Big Brother's first album, it is taken right off of one of his posters. Victor grew up in New York. He went to both Cooper Union and Yale. So he studied art with Joseph Albers, the man who wrote the book about the interaction of color. So he brought college-educated theories about color to his work in the psychedelic poster. So what do they call it? Chromatic vibration. He put that to work for his posters. And he also did photo collage. He was one of the first to use these strange collages, even though all the artists were appropriating images and using photographs of old artwork and engravings and stuff for their posters. Victor was making collage illustrations for this, as well as doing this lettering and going nuts with the color theory. So this is the center spread of the first Steve Miller Band album, where he's got two photographs of the band with the wings, and depending on what color the lights are that are being flickered in the in the light show, these wings would flap even though it was just a static image. And he was also famous for being the one who came up with this lettering that where the negative space between the letters is given the 3D treatment, so that it makes it hard to read, where you think you're trying to make sense of these marks when the letters are really in between the three-dimensional marks. So this is the cover of that Steve Miller album. The thing we saw before was the center spread of the gatefold. So again, depending on if a red or a blue light was on this illustration, the heads in the picture would go back and forth. These guys love to work together. This is a collaboration between Rick and Victor on a diptych for the family dog, who had a dance hall in Denver. So on the left is the San Francisco poster. On the right is the, did I say Denver? The left is the San Francisco poster. The right is the Denver poster. And Victor did the lettering down at the bottom of both posters, and Rick did the artwork up above. So it's sort of fire on the Denver side and flowers on the left. But one of the things you want to notice here, let's go back and look at this for just a second. You think you're looking at a halftone of this picture of Jim Kweskin, but Rick went in and took a halftone and traced every dot and put a little shine of light on every halftone dot for this illustration of Kweskin. They devoted lots of time to their work in those days. And then Rick was killed in a motorcycle accident in Petaluma in 1991. And he had been scheduled to do the cover for the next Zap Comics, Zap 13. So, and the joke was that it was one last deadline that Rick was going to miss because he was famous for being late with his artwork. So Victor took over for him and made the cover this tribute to Rick using the primary colors that Rick used so much because of the the mechanical separations as well. And Rick's alter ego was this character called Arthur Pendragon. So here's the good Rick on the angel Rick on the right and the demon Rick on the left with the bat wings and the fire wave, as well as a flying eyeball surfing on drawing and painting implements. A beautiful tribute to his friend. And then last, David Singer, who we did do this story on. So we don't have to talk too much about him, but he's the guy who loved collecting photographs. And for some reason, he had a morgue from when he was a little kid of collecting scraps of photographs. And when he saw Victor's collages, he was living in San Francisco because he was stationed here in the Navy. He started doing photo collages after Victor Moscoso's. And so he did, and by the way, this is the closing week poster for the Fillmore when Bill Graham decided to get out of, to close the Fillmores. They had this week of all San Francisco bands, and it happened so fast, they didn't have a poster for it, and they made this poster after the week was over. But look at these letters down at the bottom, especially the S. It's Mucha all over again. That S comes right from that. So David is the one who, in 1968, took these collages, the photo collages, to Bill Graham at Victor's suggestion and showed it to him, and he walked out with 12 posters to do for the summer series. And his first lettering, this is from that series. The collages were done, and Graham picked his favorite 12 of the 20 that David brought to him. And he said, "You can letter, can't you?" And David said, "Oh, yeah." And he had never lettered professionally before. But look how great he did. It was just that it was all very geometric. So his early posters were straight lines and circles and stuff he could do with drafting tools. And then he slowly got into the flow, psychedelic flow, like the one on the right. But he never outlined. So the thing that really set his posters apart was that it had a psychedelic flow, at least in the second half of this time period, but never outlines. There was another really famous collage artist in the 60s who just went by Satie. His name was Wilfred Satie, but he used old engravings and made surreal collage illustrations where David would use photographs, and they shared a studio. He said that their relationship was that they would go out for coffee and cut out pictures together. So you can see here's a poster that's straddling that idea. Look how geometric the lettering is at the bottom. It's just straight lines done with a ruler, and then the top he's got a flowing look, and he would gather his illustrations from antique stores as well as magazines. So this is Fluffy. They always called Snowball. I'm sorry, Snowball, and it was something that he found in an antique store. So I love the second half of the 60s where David started to get the flow in his words, in his letters, and became very psychedelic. And even though he started late in 1968, he ended up doing more posters for Bill Graham than anybody else, 66 of them. he also used Victor's idea of the negative area between letters being punched and disguising the letters that are in the negative. So this is TRPS for the Rock Poster Society. And here's Victor's concept again. This is for the 30th anniversary of the Summer of Love. Examples of his letters. He was also hired by Moon Alice to do some posters. He came along at the 21st poster. 20 posters had been made before he was contracted to do a poster, and he designed this Moon Alice logo for the band. And after the 1,300 posters, the over 1,300 posters, David ended up doing more than any other artist, 121 of them. So he did 121 of these things. And by the time Moon Alice came along, he was using a computer. And he said it made a gigantic difference, both in his collage and his layouts. And he started using more type, although this is all his hand lettering. There's a guy that was in our Forge group, friends of Rick Griffin from Seattle, Scott McDougall, who's a wonderful artist. And he's put out 2 books about the psychedelic poster in the Seattle area. So this is the first edition of that with his updating of Stanley's psychedelic letters. And then here's the latest edition of that where he's using Wes's roller lettering. Look at what happens with 1969 dissolving down into the credits down below. And this, of course, you can recognize that he's using this imagery from Mucha as well. And another poster from 1994 for one of the early TRPS poster expos, where he's, you recognize this? It's Fay Ray from King Kong. And here's a tribute to Rick. He can really do Rick's lettering. Look at this cartoony take on Rick's style. Scott's really wonderful. In the early 2000s, I ended up living next door and behind and one house over from Adelia. And Adelia had her father's desk from when he was a little kid in the garage. And she needed to get rid of it, as long as she had kept it. And so I wrote to the FORG people and said, did anybody want Rick's desk from when he was a kid? And Scott was the one who came down from Seattle, loaded it up and took it back to Seattle and restored it. So he's got Rick Griffin's desk. Jim Phillips is a Santa Cruz artist. You know him from the Santa Cruz skateboards. This famous, screaming hand is his image. And he did psychedelic posters. These are 2 Santa Cruz concerts using the lettering like the Blob from the monster movies. Really great stuff. And Jim Phillips is one of the very first to start using the computer for psychedelic posters. So these are all, you can see the throwback to the traditional psychedelic poster in this, but all done on the computer. And modern day artists, Emick, the psychedelic poster is still alive. There's still lots going on. If any of you get emails from the concert promoters, Folk Yeah, they design a poster for every gig, even if they're just putting it online. So the psychedelic poster is still happening. This is all work. Even this work now is about 15 years old. But the modern psychedelic poster is still around. And we're going to close with David Singer's. Here's his Moon Alice logo. And this is a selection of different artists that Moon Alice has hired to do these posters for every one of their gigs. And then we're going to end with 3 of David's. And David ended up putting the Moon Alice logo in every one of his posters. This one is hidden someplace. Is it in the sky? Oh, I'm not seeing it. David, did you cheat us on this one? Anyway, hand lettered, but he ended up using type a lot once he started using the computer to do his psychedelic posters. So we're going to end with just a couple of my attempts at psychedelic calligraphy, whether with a pen or a brush or cutting out of paper. Psychedelic stuff has always influenced my calligraphy, even when it's kind of traditional. There's something that droops about it and looks kind of cartoony. It's a psychedelic influence. So last image, those two poster exhibitions in Vienna or Germany and San Francisco or New York. And wow, sorry that took so long.